The mountains hold their secrets tightly. Their slopes rise like the backs of sleeping beasts, their forests thick, their hollows silent but for the drip of rain and the crackle of distant thunder. And in these shadowed ridges of Appalachia, stories take root like tangled roots in the soil, whispers that no outsider can fully untangle. Tales of families who lived so far from the world that they seemed to dissolve into myth. Among these stories, none chills the blood more than the legend of the Whitakers. It begins not with a scream, but with silence. Imagine the year, the 1800s slipping into the 1900s, when Appalachia was not yet mapped or tamed, when coal towns were only beginning to carve their way into the hills. Deep in a forgotten valley, a shack squatted at the end of a dirt path that led nowhere else. Its boards sagged, its windows darkened, its roof patched with rusted tin. Smoke rose thin from its chimney, though neighbors swore they never saw firelight inside. Travelers who wandered too close carried back strange tales of figures who moved in shadows, figures with faces both familiar and distorted, who stared, without speaking, who barked or grunted rather than greeted. The Whitakers lived in that shack. Generation upon generation, they stayed there, in the same hollow, marrying only among themselves.
Subscribe to my
Brothers
channel.
to sisters, cousins to cousins, fathers to daughters. Their family tree wound around itself until branches tangled into a knot. It was not merely poverty that sealed them away. It was a kind of burial in life, a chosen isolation that became a curse, and in time, their very bodies bore the mark of that burial. Children born to them grew with pale skin, slack mouths, eyes that wandered in different directions. Some did not speak at all, but made guttural sounds half animal, half human. Others could walk the roads but hung their heads in shame, unable to look a stranger in the eye. Theirs was a life of survival at the lowest edge of human endurance. Scraps of food scavenged, water drawn from a muddy creek, dogs as both companions and guards. When the mines came, the Whitakers did not join. When the towns grew, they did not enter. They remained on their plot of earth, as if bound by an invisible chained to the soil that had birthed them. To outsiders, the shack became a haunted place. Children dared each other to creep close, to peer at the windows where eyes might suddenly appear, staring blankly from within. Adults spoke in hushed voices, not daring to name what they had seen. They called them the inbreds, the mongrels. Even the cannibals' words meant to strip them of humanity. For when people fear what they cannot understand, they turn their neighbors into monsters. But the Whitakers were not monsters. They were human. They felt hunger, shame, the cold bite of winter through the gaps in their boards. They felt the sting of whispers that carried across the mountains, branding them with names they could never shake. Perhaps they made choices that twisted bloodlines. Perhaps isolation gave them no choices at all. Either way, they became trapped in a living tomb, a family that time forgot, preserved in silence like insects in amber. One tale tells of a traveler who once approached their home in search of water. He knocked upon the door, and after a long pause, it opened. What he saw inside, he would only half speak of later. A family sitting in stillness, their faces slack, their skin pale, their eyes flickering toward him without sound. One man barked, like a dog, the others rocked back and forth. The visitor left his canteen behind, too shaken to take it back, and fled into the woods. He never returned. The Appalachian air seemed to change around the Whitaker home. Even the wind carried whispers differently through that hollow, as if the mountains themselves had learned to lower their voices when passing over their roof. And so the family lived, year after year, children born only to repeat the same cycle. Mothers giving birth to daughters, who would become wives to their own brothers. Sons who would grow into fathers of their sisters' children. A circle drawn tighter and tighter, with no door open to the outside world. To speak of cannibalism was perhaps a cruelty invented by outsiders, a way to explain deformity through horror. Yet when bones were found in the woods, when hunters claimed to hear strange animal cries to human to be wolf. The whispers grew louder. They feed on what they can, some muttered. Even on each other. No one could prove it. No one dared to try. But the idea took root, and once planted, it never left. Still, what is most haunting is not the legend, but the humanity behind it. Imagine the girl born into that shack, hearing nothing but the voices of her brothers, her cousins, her mother, who is also kin in more ways than one. She has no word for shame, because no one has taught her a world where shame exists. She learns to rock in silence, to move like the others, to survive as best she can. And outside, the mountains rise, magnificent, eternal, indifferent. She will never climb them. She will never see beyond them. The Whitakers became a mirror. The town refused to look into a reflection of poverty, isolation, and fear that Appalachia wished to bury. Yet the shack still stood. And sometimes, when the fog rolled thick and the night dogs barked at shadows, the townsfolk swore they could still hear voices, grunts, barks, or cries rising faintly from the hollow. This was the world of the Whitaker family, a world of silence, whispers, and hunger. A world locked away, not by iron bars, but by geography, by shame, and by bloodlines twisted inward until nothing could escape. And it is here that our story begins. In the stillness of the Appalachian woods, where the mountains themselves seem to conspire to keep the truth hidden. The silence of the Whitakers' hollow was not empty. It was heavy, like air before a storm, pressing upon anyone who dared step too close. And yet, outsiders could not stay away forever. Curiosity is a dangerous spark, especially when lit against the dry tinder of rumor. What lay behind those warped boards and sunken windows? What truth hid in the shadows where no one spoke? The first encounters were accidental hunters crossing paths with strange figures in the woods. They described pale faces that turned too quickly, eyes unfocused, movements animal-like. Some swore they saw a boy crawling on all fours, panting like a hound, his tongue lolling, his lips stained with dirt. When they tried to call out, he scuttled back into the brush with uncanny speed. A glimpse, no more. Yet the memory lingered, like a fever dream. In time, braver men came not out of pity, but to prove the legends wrong, or perhaps to confirm them. They brought lanterns, their light trembling in the fog, their hands gripping rifles, though they spoke of just looking. When they reached the shack, the dogs came first. Mangy, wild-eyed, their barks shattered the quiet. Behind them, in the doorway, shapes gathered, not one, not two, but several, their faces slack, their clothes soiled, their eyes darting nervously. A girl clutched at the frame, her knuckles white, her mouth half open as if to speak, yet no word formed. Behind her, a man barked, the sound sharp, guttural, echoing off the hills. The intruders did not linger. Fear, not compassion, drove them away. They returned to their towns with tales dripping with horror. Each retelling added another layer of cannibal feasts, of rituals in the woods, of children born with twisted limbs. Truth became tangled with imagination until no one could separate one from the other. The Whitakers, isolated and voiceless, could not defend themselves. Their silence was filled by the voices of others, and those voices spoke only in fear. Yet there were fragments of truth, glimpses caught by rare eyes willing to see. A missionary once tried to reach them, carrying food and blankets. He wrote that the family lived in filth, their shack crumbling, their clothes little more than rags. He described their eyes haunted, confused, yet unmistakably human. They were not demons, he wrote, but people consumed by isolation, shaped by choices made generations before they were born. His words were quickly forgotten. Horror sells. Compassion does not. The years pressed on. Generation after generation, the cycle turned. A girl born became a mother to her brother's children. A boy born grew into a father to his sister's sons. The branches twisted tighter, until their family tree was no tree at all, but a knotted root ball, dark and impenetrable. Outsiders called it unnatural, but inside that shack, it was life as they knew it, the only rhythm they had ever been given, and, yet, in such darkness, survival took on its own brutal poetry. They lived without farms, without mines, without schools. They scavenged, they hunted, they kept to themselves, and if sometimes the food was not enough, if sometimes the whispers of cannibalism bore a kernel of truth, who among us, starving, could swear we would not do the same? It is easier to call them monsters than to admit they reflected something buried deep within us all, the lengths to which human beings will go to survive by the mid-20th century. Word of the Whitakers had spread far beyond the mountains. Writers, journalists, even filmmakers came searching. Some were driven by morbid fascination, others by pity, others by the hunger to shock their audiences. Each found something different. Some found only silence, the family too frightened to emerge from their shack, staring blankly from the windows until the strangers left. Others captured photographs that would later haunt the world, gaunt faces, slack jaws, eyes that seemed both vacant and pleading, locked forever in grainy frames. But what those images could not show was the weight of their silence, for silence was their language. When asked a question, many could not respond. Some barked, some grunted, some covered their faces, as if ashamed. In those sounds, the world heard confirmation of monstrosity. Few heard the deeper truth, that this was the end of a lineage, so sealed in upon itself that language itself had withered away. And so the legend of the Whitakers became more than a story, it became a warning, a tale whispered in Appalachian towns, told to children around campfires. Stay away from the hollow, they were told, for the inbred cannibals live there, and they will drag you inside. But the true horror was not that they might drag someone in. The true horror was that they could never leave. The shack still stands, weathered and sagging, its boards gray, its roof patched, its windows empty. Around it, the mountains rise, indifferent as ever, holding their silence like a secret pressed into the stone. The Whitakers live on, their name now a shadow that drifts between legend and truth, and if you stand in that hollow at dusk, the dogs barking, the fog rolling low, you may swear you hear it too. A sound rising from within the shack, a sound not quite human, not quite animal. A bark, a grunt, a cry that chills the marrow. And you wonder how much of this is myth, and how much is the truth we cannot bear to face.